Part three of the book embraces the Serizal's revolutionary spirit in challenging entrenched ideas and fostering transformative change in education. This section of the book is particularly powerful as it examines how we can break down barriers and create spaces where all voices are heard and valued. In this segment, we focus on Chapter 11, a compelling piece that demonstrates how physical spaces, particularly university campuses, can serve as catalysts for critical inquiry and the reimagining of local history. We are delighted to have our distinguished contributors who will share their innovative approach to using geographic imagination and difficult history to transform how we understand and teach about our local spaces and communities. They wrote the chapter Geographic Imagination and Difficult History, Remaking Local Spaces and Community.
Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to invite each of our guests to briefly introduce themselves and their connection to this work. Jesus, can we start with you?
Hi, I'm Jesus Tirado. I'm an assistant professor here at Auburn for social studies education. I come to this work as someone who's interested in thinking about how histories overlap with each other and how we can best learn about them. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Demoini. I am also here at Auburn University, and I teach elementary pre-service teachers social studies methods. And I come to this work recognizing that there were a lot of spaces of silence in my community growing up and in my educational experience. And so I am really trying to recognize that, to wrestle with that, and also to make sure that we're trying to kind of dismantle and disrupt those spaces of silence for the students that are going through our programs.
Thank you both for introducing yourselves. I'm wondering if you could now provide us with an overview of the chapter that you've contributed to this book.
So we came to this chapter to kind of describe some of the work that we're doing with our pre-service teachers at Auburn University around a space that historically may have a lot of silence histories, but more recently has begun to disrupt those and tell different stories in this space. So we kind of ground this knowing that all spaces are telling stories. And that we should be asking questions about like whose stories are allowed to be told here, whose stories are honored, whose stories are displayed for us to see, and that spaces are just kind of these physical conduits of power. And so we try to think about that as we look at this space called Pebble Hill, a former plantation cottage that is owned by the university.
And spaces are actively telling their stories, whether they're silencing them or not. And as Sarah mentioned before, Pebble Hill is one of these sites that's trying to retell their stories in new and exciting and interesting ways. One of the first ways that's evident is from the plaques outside the door, the main door going into Pebble Hill. There's actually 3 plaques. There's another one that we don't see here that's about the historic nature of the home. It's one of the oldest homes in town. But these do speak to how the site is trying to change the stories that have been traditionally silenced at Pebble Hill. The top plaque acknowledges the work of people who were enslaved at Pebble Hill. It was written in conjunction with some of their descendants. So they collaborated on writing this project together. As you can see, it was mounted in 2021. And the one on the bottom acknowledges that Pebble Hill rests on the ancestral site of the Creek Indians who were pushed out with indigenous expulsion in the 1840s. So both of these plaques start to really change or start to mark how some of these stories are highlighted and can be more easily accessed in the home. One of the things that's important to recognize within that is how maps are telling a story. All 3 of these maps are ones that are on display in the center of the home, in the foyer of the home, if you will. And they tell a different story about the creation of what we now know as Lee County, Alabama, and Auburn, Alabama, starting with early maps of the Cherokee and Creek Indian lands, lands that then got, you can start to see the encroachment of the state of Alabama on those lands in the center, with the border kind of cutting across what we now know as the border between Alabama and Georgia. And finally, a map that is more similar to the map that we see today of the state, which has no indigenous reservation on it, lands acknowledged as those people got pushed out. And as we start thinking about the borders and the borders that we recognize and the borders we don't recognize, we often think about the borders today as spaces that we know and see as permanent, and we don't see them as moving and changing. And that's a very colonial way of thinking about them, and recognizing that borders and border lands and border spaces are constantly changing is real important for our pre-service teachers who are going to be teaching students and teaching in environments where they are changing and things are changing. So if we can prepare them to think about maps in more dynamic ways, they're going to be able to address the histories of these spaces in more dynamic ways.
So Jesus just talked about kind of two types of sources that we look at when we take our students to Pebble Hill, looking at maps and kind of colonial vocabulary there, and how we try to talk about space. And then also through these government documents and kind of the institutionalization of enslavement and of institutional racism in our country. And so the third type of source that we look at Pebble Hill is one of a video, and really thinking about the stories of people from this space. Saeed talks about geographical imagination a lot, and thinking about how stories of different spaces help us to have imaginations of others. And that could otherize other people. We kind of separate ourselves through these stories. And so it's really important for us to use the stories of descendants of enslaved people from Pebble Hill as we take students, to really make sure that those accounts and those oral histories passed down through generations in this family are told from them, and that that those stories are not being silenced and are helping us kind of disrupt some of the othering that has happened over time. So students at this site, the picture on the left is of Dr. Terrence Bickerstaff, who has done a lot of family history of his family that, again, was descended from those enslaved at Pebble Hill. And we use excerpts from a symposium talk that he gave that really talks about his family there, the skills that they had, talks about the forming of the family, and two of his ancestors that formed a family and then were legally able to be recognized as married right after the Civil War ended. And they have their marriage certificate there at Pebble Hill, or a replica of that, to see. And so we make sure that kind of these stories are brought in, so that, again, students are kind of thinking about how stories shape spaces, and are considering stories that they probably haven't heard before. And so as teachers, we really want to think about how can we look at our communities and spaces of silence in our communities, so that we can begin to disrupt that silence. And in our chapter, we kind of talk about three ways that we, as authors, Jesus, Mark, and I, have done that, through ways that we have tried to build our historical local content knowledge, the ways that we can align these with state curricula, and then ways that we are really engaging with civic organizations to continue to disrupt spaces of silence in our communities today, beyond just our classroom and with pre-service teachers. So we hope that the chapter is helpful for others as they are thinking about spaces in their own community.
Thank you for that overview. We do have a couple of follow-up questions for you. I'd like to begin by asking, in your experience, what are some of the most significant challenges educators face when attempting to dismantle these silences? How do these challenges vary across different educational contexts?
Well, I can start, and I'm sure that Jesus may jump in. So we are in Alabama, We're in a state that has passed anti-DEI legislation, and that's in effect. I think all of the listeners that are in the United States are in a space that has a current executive order, maybe in limbo, I don't know, in terms of kind of restricting curriculum in schools. And so I think we have to be honest about the fact that these are racist policies that are being legislated and put into place. And I think that with our pre-service teachers, we have to be really honest about that as well. So I'll speak for myself, and Jesus can maybe share in terms of with secondary folks, but with elementary, I think one thing is that we really look at our standards carefully and realize that we are able to teach these silenced histories by using our standards and knowing our standards and being able to clearly use our standards to justify doing the work that we need to be doing. And so I think that is an important part, to think about how your standards can actually provide you some justification. I also think that it's really important that the stories we were telling in our chapter are local. And I think that whenever we can focus on local histories, that communities are much more willing to engage. That can be a little scary when you're highlighting local histories that are difficult histories of oppression. But I also think when you can tie them to local spaces and you can bring in the community to talk about those histories as well, that people are more open to talking about that. And it just provides more opportunity to make the connection with students as well.
I would second that. I think for my students, for secondary students, a lot of it is about knowing the standards, but then also knowing how to fit the stories that you want to tell alongside those standards, and recognizing that they're already there, as Sarah already noted, and getting them comfortable with what that alignment means or what that alignment looks like, and be willing to be patient with students as they're thinking about and processing these things together, and recognizing that you're learning along with them. So an overall attitude of learning and supporting the learners of a classroom space as you're engaging in these stories. And 100% agree with Sarah that local stories tend to be a bit more dynamic and personable. You're already kind of uncovering a story because our textbooks are filled with very kind of national broad strokes. So when you sit with a local story, you're just going to naturally get a lot more nuance as you kind of sit in the spaces where things are occurring. You're sitting with the stories where things are occurring, and often with it's easier to find people who are related or closely related to stories where that occurs. And I think that's always going to make for a much more meaningful connection, both to the story and the orientation of these stories together.
Thank you both for your attention to the importance of local history and how our students and our communities can connect to that. And as well as your important distinction of we have an obligation to teach these standards. And so when we link these stories there, it really deepens our work and provides space for that. Another question that I have for you is, when discussing difficult histories and local spaces, how can educators ensure their approaches are inclusive and respectful of all students' backgrounds and experiences? What considerations should they keep in mind when engaging in such conversations?
I can start, and then Sarah, I hope you add to it. But I think what I tell my students is that it's about thinking about how we lead to those stories and how we build to those stories, and how we kind of support everyone who's learning their stories together, and also recognizing that not all stories are silenced to all people the same way. So, I think about the fact Dr. Vickerstaff, who Sarah talked about in the presentation, he was a student in our local schools, and he was carrying these stories because he spent time with his grandparents who told him these stories. So he was someone who was in these spaces where these stories weren't getting talked about. Um, and I think it's important to recognize that our students are carrying those stories. And I think it's also significant when teachers share stories. I watched a local teacher um, talk about learning about his own family's implication in some of these stories. And it was from a very personal, not very didactic. It was from a very like, I'm going through this struggle. I'm sharing stories from my own perspective. And I'm just inviting you that if you want to think about these things, we can think about these things together. So very much here's where I am. I want to meet you where you are approach. And that once again, invite students in as learners and not as people who need to, memorize things for a test. And I think that approach is always going to make these more, it's going to open up that space for these more nuanced, wonderfully complex stories to actually be woven together in a constructive way instead of feeling like you're being talked down to or you're being forced to see this orientation. It invites you to kind of move in and out and understand like how that mosaic is actually pieced together.
I think building off of Jesus, I would say we kind of open our chapter with a few questions of just whose stories are allowed here, whose stories are honored, whose stories are not told. And I think just helping students begin to kind of ask questions about power in the first place helps to kind of open up space for us to see like whose stories are silenced right now and to have conversations about why that is. I also think that students, as we're looking at, particularly if we're looking kind of at historical stories, for us to provide opportunity for students to think about, they can get kind of stuck in the historical moment. And so I think it's important to then kind of come to today and think about, okay, when we see injustice in this way, when we see someone being dehumanized, then what is our response today, right? Like, we can't change how this story was necessarily before, but we do still have issues that we need to look at today. And so what can we learn from stories of resistance, and what can we learn of stories of advocacy, and how can we then think about when we see injustice today, how we disrupt that in the spaces that we're in and out of today. So I think bringing that connection forward helps to everyone leave somewhat empowered to be able to do something.
For your forward thinking of what this looks like as we move forward, that as we engage with students in a specific story and capturing the power dynamics involved there, that it's not just about that story, but it's about where can they uncover silent stories and move that into their day-to-day operations as they navigate the world.
Thank you for participating in this important discussion about geographic imagination and difficult history and social science education. And we hope that you find information and interest in reading their chapter in this book.